All right. Welcome, everybody. Carlos, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce yourself and kick it off.
Sounds great. Thank you very much, Steve. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Carlos Brito. I'm a PM in the Intune for Education product team. And with Windows 11 now released, I would like to walk you through the Windows 11 enrollment experiences with Microsoft Endpoint Manager. Here's our agenda. I'm going to cover two different topics. The first one is the configuration of the new Start menu layout, since it's a critical component of the first sign-in experience of Windows 11. And we'll focus on the customization of two main areas, the Start pins and the taskbar. For the second part, we'll shift our focus to the enrollment experience for both personal devices and corporate-owned devices, with or without user interactions during the initial device setup experience. All right. Okay, we're going to start with the new Start menu configuration. So again, we'll cover the Start pins customization, and the Start pins is the new area in the Start menu layout where you have the 3 rows and 6 columns of icons in here. Administrators and users can actually pin additional applications outside of just the 3 rows of icons. And when they do so, the users will be provided with an option to scroll on the right-hand side of the Start pin with the ability to go to the next set of icons. The taskbar, it's very similar to what we used to have with Windows 10, where you can define the set of applications that are going to be automatically pinned to the taskbar. The main difference here, there's an additional icon that can be customized on and off, which is the chat icon for Teams for Personal. And we'll go through the steps for enabling and disabling that option as well. All right, so starting with the MDM configuration for configuring Start pins. The way you configure this one is using the Configure Start pins new CSP that was available and created with Windows 11. That falls under the Policy CSP, under the Start area. And it accepts a JSON file here with 2 different types of references, a desktop app ID, a package ID, and a desktop app link, which is the least recommended here since desktop links can actually change places frequently. And the best way really to achieve this specific configuration for you to configure through the MDM channel is to use the export start layout with the option to create a JSON. This way, what you can do is create a Windows 11 device with the Start pins and Start layout or taskbar experience that you wish for your devices to have, create an export. And this way you can use that configuration that you've generated to be able to make sure that the other devices that you enroll mimic the same experience. All right, so for web apps that you can include as part of the Start pins, you can use Windows standard shortcuts. You can use Intune web apps. And the one that gives the user the best experience is configuring Edge policy by using the configured list of forced installed web apps, which you're going to see in a little bit here in the next session. And so for Intune web apps, you can simply configure the Start pin using the desktop app ID. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, you can simply use the URL as the reference for that desktop app ID. One important thing to note here is Intune does not provide the ability to add a custom icon. So at the end of the day, the icon that's going to be showing on the end user desktop is the default icon of whatever browser is the default browser for that specific target machine. So the next one is shortcut files, and you can use this deploying your preferred method. So you can use a PowerShell script, for example. You can use a Win32 application in Intune to be able to create that shortcut. And once you create that shortcut, you can use the desktop app link with the location of where that shortcut file is as part of a Start pin configuration. So now let's move over to the one that provides a much better user experience here is through the creation of an edge policy by configuring the list of forced installed web apps. So with that policy, which can be configured in Endpoint Manager by creating a policy using our settings catalog. So once you create the policy here, I'm going to try to make it a little bit bigger. You can simply search for configure list of forced apps, which will then have the Microsoft Edge policy setting. You can then configure a list of forced installed web apps, and then you can provide the list of forced web apps that will be installed. The cool part about this one right here is based on the URL that you provide, it determines whether the app has the capability of progressive web apps or just standard web links. And most importantly here, the shortcut icons for those applications will take on the form of the fave icon that's configured for the target URL. So you essentially get the icon that the website designer expected you to have. And you get whether the application have a progressive web app capability or just a standard web link. So once again, for this here, you could deploy it to a device, make sure that the device has all of the apps that you want to include as part of the start pin, and then use the export PowerShell command to get a JSON, and you can then configure the target machine exactly the same way you captured your original machine. So for start pins, the way you deploy the actual policy to configure the start pins in Microsoft Endpoint Manager today is by using a Windows 10 custom policy, or we tend to call them OMA URI policies. And you have to leverage the configure start pin CSP as we talked about. And this would be the full path since this is under the policy CSP. And you essentially just define as a string and you provide the output of your PowerShell command that we talked about earlier in here. And then the device should take on the form of the exported JSON file. All right, so next we'll talk about how to configure taskbar options. So taskbar is determining what applications would be pinned, on the start menu for Windows 11. So, in here you can determine if you want to add some additional custom applications in addition to what is default to Windows 11, or remove potentially some of the things that are native to Windows 11. And you can also toggle on and off the new chat icon for Teams Personal. So for taskbar layout, this is actually the exact same policy as you had for your Windows 10 devices. So the start menu layout that you had for Windows 10 devices also contained a section for configuring the taskbar. So if you actually had a Windows 10 policy deployed to a Windows 11 device, and that Windows 10 policy contained a taskbar portion of the policy, it would still be consumed by your Windows 11 device. Obviously, the other portions of the start menu layout that's not applicable to Windows 11 would not be applied, but the taskbar, which is the same, would be applied. One important thing to note here is that some of the paths for Windows 11, for some of the default built-in applications, for example, File Explorer, may have changed file path. So be sure to verify that the path defines in your policies for Windows 11 devices match the correct location in Windows 11. Okay, and another important difference here compared to the start pins is that this policy is only applied at logon only, meaning any policy change post logon would only take effect on the next time the user logs in, as opposed to the start pins, which can take effect, after the user signs in, and will process any additional start pin changes once the user has already, established a login to their desktop. Okay, the way you configure this here is using a device restriction policy, and this is the exact same policy that you were using for your Windows 10 devices, right? So the difference here is for your Windows 11 devices, make sure that you extract out the taskbar customization portion of it, since a lot of the previous items for the start menu, since it's so changed, would not take effect on a Windows 11 machine. But in essence, the same location. So under devices, Windows 10 and later policy, and you just select the device restriction policy in Intune, you'll be able to get to this policy, and there's a section called Start, and that's where you would put your test bar customization.xml. Okay. All right, so for the final option here is the ability to turn on and off the chat icon that controls the team's personal icon that's default on the taskbar for Windows 11. So for this one here, you can use a settings catalog policy in Endpoint Manager. So once you create a new policy or edit an existing ones, you simply have to search for, I'm going to try to highlight this here, just search for chat icon. You'll be provided with the option of experience. And then one of the sub items here is configure chat icon. So once you select the item here, you see that you can hide and disable. Show is the default option. Unless you had previously disabled, the options you have available be hide and disable. Okay. All right, so now that we've seen all of the different ways to configure the start pin and the taskbar. So let's see what a user experience will look like. So here we have a student, Allison, trying to log in to her device after IT has configured the start menu experience for Windows 11. So this is what she'll be presented with here. So as you can see, she has a customized set of start pins. And what you'll find is some applications will only be installed after she logs in for the first time. For example, Teams. So as you could see, Teams got placed to its rightful spot on the start pin location. And so did Wikipedia, which is a web app, progressive web app that we deployed. And we've set that specific application to be the last app to be shown in the start pin. And you also can see here that there were a couple of additional icons added to the taskbar. Okay, so that's overall the end user experience after configuring a custom start menu experience. Okay, now we're going to shift our focus to the Windows 11 enrollment experience with Windows 11. And this is going to be a succession of many different enrollment types that we support, starting with personally owned enrollment scenarios that will essentially enroll the device as a personal device in Intune. And we have a couple of different paths for getting a device enrolled as a personal device, and we'll walk through each one of those scenarios, starting with modern app sign-in. We're going to walk through the add work or school account, and we'll finally take a look at the company portal enrollment flow. And you will see, for those of you familiar with those flows with Windows 10, that the experience hasn't changed significantly. There were a couple of minor additions in a few different places, but for the most part, the overall flow remains quite similar. So you won't necessarily have a substantial change of experience for enrolling devices in Endpoint Manager from 10 to 11. But the overall look and feel of the OS is drastically changed. All right, so let's start this with the modern app sign-in experience. And for this one here, Allison once again is logging into her device, but this time she's logging in with a Microsoft account or a local account. And she's going to open Edge. She can then add a school account here on this device. And by doing so, she's going to trigger what we call the modern app sign-in flow, which will allow her to Azure AD register her device so she can gain single sign-on and potentially MDM enroll, depending on the choice that she provides doing that enrollment flow. So here, I'm going to just pause quickly here. One of the things that I wanted to point out here, which is important, because there are a lot of confusion regarding that specific experience. There are quite a few modes here that I wanted to walk you through one by one. The first one is the default experience, as you see here, by simply selecting OK, because the allow my organization to manage my device being selected. By clicking OK, this will do a few things. One, it will Azure AD register this device in her organization or school. And secondly, it will automatically MDM enroll this device into Endpoint Manager. Okay, so with that selection, she will have the device Azure AD registered, have the device MDM enrolled, and she will automatically get the ability to do single sign-on for any organizational apps that leverages her Azure AD credentials. Okay, so we've had several instances where devices ended up being managed where they were not intended to. So if the device is not intended to be managed, you can simply uncheck the allow my organization to manage my devices and select OK. This would still allow Allison, in this case here, to gain a single sign-on to other applications that leverage her Azure AD credential, but the device would not end up in mobile device management or endpoint manager in this case here. Okay, so that's yet another way that you could have proceeded in gaining SSO because the Azure AD registration would still occur, but not have the device MDM enrolled if that's not the intended behavior. And then finally, the final option here is if she selected no, sign in to this app only, this would only sign in to Edge and Edge only. So other apps that she tries to access for her school or organization would require her to enter credentials again. Okay, so just very important here because a lot of confusion in that area. I wanted to make sure that it gets cleared out. So for all of the scenarios, because it's a user-driven enrollment process, it's going to set affinity to that specific user in this device as part of the registration process, both into Azure AD and Intune. So we're going to have to proceed here. Okay. So once she signs in here, we'll speed it up a little bit since. Oh, sorry about that. All right, so let's proceed with Allison adding an account to Edge. So she's still in the modern app sign-in experience here by signing into Edge to get her device Azure AD joined and MDM enrolled. So she provides her credentials here, and she's going to choose the default option because she indeed wants her device to be managed. So she'll select OK. And now the device will be Azure AD registered and MDM enrolled, and she'll be able to get single sign-on to any of her school or organization applications that leverages her Azure AD credentials. So here, to be able to verify that the device has been successfully MDM enrolled and a worker school account was created, you can see under worker school that you have her account in there. And the info button is an indication that the device was successfully MDM enrolled. And as you can see here, we already started to get some policies and applications, which include Minecraft. So if I select Minecraft here, because I'm expected to get single sign-on, once I launch Minecraft, I'm going to be able to automatically sign in as Allison without having to provide credentials here. So that's the modern app sign-in experience that enrolls the device both in Azure AD and into Intune for management. So now moving on to the add work or school account, which is very similar here. Once again, the device will be Azure AD registered. It's a personal type of enrollment, and affinity will be set to that specific user that's going through the workflow. So Allison logs in again with the Microsoft account. But this time we're going to go to settings. We're going to go to accounts here and select access work or school account. There are a couple of choices here, right? So she could choose to enroll only in device management. That will not give her SSO or single sign-on. In this case here, she wants to get single sign-on. So we're actually going to proceed with adding a work or school account here. So we're going to say connect and enter her credentials here to be able to add a work or school account. So she not only Azure AD register her device so she can get single sign-on, but also MDM enrolls that device so she can get policies and applications that are targeted as required to her device or her user UPN. So she's going to click done here. So the process is completed. And once again, you can validate by expanding a worker school account, and the info button indicates that the device has been successfully MDM enrolled. And as you can see, we'll list the policies and apps that have come down at that point. It's been just a few minutes. You're going to start to see the applications flow down. Once again, Minecraft came down in that specific flow. And because she's expected to get single sign-on, once again, she can automatically sign in that specific flow. Okay. All right. So now let's go to the workflow, the company portal. And again, this workflow is extremely similar here. She logs into her device, but this time she's going to have to go get the company portal app from the store to be able to complete the workflow. And the nice thing about leveraging the company portal here is once she completes that process, not only she can get the device successfully enrolled into her organization, she can also get a single sign-on as a result, because it triggers, if you recall, you're going to see here a very familiar path, which is the modern app sign-in flow, because we are actually using yet another app. So this is a familiar flow to you now. So, and to Allison, so she can just hit OK here. She could have the choice of just saying no and just sign into that app, but she wants single sign-on as well. And one of the cool benefits to using the company portal, it's a guided flow. And also now that she has the company portal, not only she has the ability to get required apps automatically targeted to her device, she can also self-service any application that may be available to her for installation whenever she needs it. Okay. So that is the company portal flow. So now that is the end of the personal device enrollment flows that we talked about. Now let's shift focus to the enrollment flow for corporate-owned devices. And this flow, we're going to divide it into two main flows. One with user interaction, which is the one we're going to start here, and the following without user interaction for those scenarios that you do not want to have user interaction doing the provisioning of the device. Okay, so for this one, we're going to go through the standard out-of-box experience without autopilot, and then we're going to go to the autopilot user-driven mode, and then followed by the autopilot pre-provision, which is also previously known as the autopilot white glove process. All right, for UBI without autopilot, one of the main differences here is for all of those corporate scenarios, the user will also have the ability to log into their devices using their Azure AD credentials, right? Because the device would now be Azure AD joined and not Azure AD registered. So standard familiar UBI workflow here, are going to choose the region and the keyboard or any other additional keyboards. And one of the key differences with using UBI without autopilot is that with the standard flow, the user will be asked whether they would walk through a personal enrollment or a corporate enrollment. A lot of the UBI screens that are hidden through the autopilot process will be shown here. And also the user will be automatically made local admin on the device. So I'm going to put a pause here. So this is yet another new functionality for Windows 11. We've heard from a lot of IT admins that they would like to have the ability doing the UBI flow to be able to provide a custom name to a device doing the provisioning experience. So this is available now with Windows 11 with, through the standard UBI flow or through autopilot if you do not have the naming template pre-configured in your profile. But once again, because this is the standard UBI flow without autopilot, the user that's configuring this device here will be made automatically a local admin on their devices, which may not be a desired state, for a lot of schools or enterprises. So again, here you're able. Oops, let's go back there. For this specific scenario, you can choose to put a name, but in our case here, we're going to skip the naming part of the process, just so it doesn't cause a restart in the middle of the UBI flow here. But in a standard workflow, an admin could choose to enter a name before the device gets, fully provisioned and Azure AD joined and subsequently MDM enrolled. So let's follow the flow here. So again, here you could put a custom name. In our case, we're just going to skip it for now, just so we don't have a reboot in the middle of the provisioning flow. But here is where you get asked whether you're going to set up this device as personal because it's not autopilot registered, or work. We're going to do work because we're going to do an enrollment as a corporate device in my organization. I provide my credentials. Once I provide my credentials here and my privacy choices, I'm then able to get to my desktop and start to receive all of the policies that have been targeted to this specific device through MDM. Right, as you can see, I just received a custom start menu layout, and I'm going to start to receive also applications that are specifically targeted to me. Okay, we'll move on to autopilot user driven. So again, the primary benefit here is you can simplify the out-of-box experience for the end user by skipping some of the UBI screens that the user would otherwise have to select an option for, just like we did here without autopilot just previously. And you can also make sure that the user is enrolling the device into your organization. And most importantly, which is the most desired outcome of this here, is you can also determine whether the user will be a standard user or an administrator, which in most cases, users are configured to be standard users and not local admins. Okay, so let's take a look at the flow. So you will see there'll be a lot more simplified. And obviously, all the videos have been accelerated a bit so that you guys wouldn't have to wait for the typical process to take place. But all the steps are there. So I'm going to connect to Wi-Fi in this specific case. Right, so you will see that some of the screens that we had to configure previously does not get prompted to the user because that's also configured as part of the autopilot profile. So now the user simply has to put in their credentials, and they're able to start receiving apps and policies that are targeted to either the device or to Allison as a user. And we'll see a flow in which we can pre-cache some apps and policies prior to the user completing the flow in a couple minutes here. All right, so that's the experience for the autopilot user-driven flow. And for those of you familiar with this flow, you likely see a lot of similarities with the previous flow, since not a whole lot has changed here outside of just the UI being a little bit more streamlined. All right, so now let's go to the autopilot pre-provisioning flow. So again, this is a corporate device enrollment. The devices get Azure AD joined, which means that users will have the ability to log into their devices with an Azure AD account. And in this case here, what we're doing is two different parts of the flow. First is a flow that generally is performed by your reseller or your OEM, but it can also be performed by your IT organization before you hand out the device to the students. This is to allow for a better first use experience of the device so that on first use, the user already has all of the apps and policies that they need to be productive, right? So here we're going to first do the flow for the admin. And after that, we're going to walk the end user part of the flow, which is similar to the user-driven flow. The difference is by that time, when the user walks through that specific step, the device is already MDM enrolled and already pre-configured with a set of apps and policies. So the first thing you do here, I'll just do a little pause there. You hit Windows 5 times once you get to the region screen. And that will bring you up to this screen, and you select the option pre-provision with Windows Autopilot. And again, this is the admin flow, not the end user. This is to get the device pre-provisioned ahead of shipping the device shipping the device to students. So let's go back there. Oh. There we go. So I choose the pre-provision with Windows Autopilot, and what this will do is will get the device recognize the pre-provision profile in Autopilot that I have. The QR code can be used with our custom app to be able to customize some aspects of the device, for example, device name. So here we're gonna get the device MDM enrolled, and we're gonna make sure that we process any policies and apps that are targeted to this specific device so that the user has a great first time experience. If everything went right, you get a green checkbox, or you get a red error here indicating that a problem occurs. If everything went well, your device setup is complete, and the admin can simply reseal the device at this point here, which is going to put the device back into the standard UBI flow for the user to complete the process, very much like if they're going through the standard autopilot user-driven mode. Again, the difference is the device is already pre-cached with what the user needs, and the device is already MDM enrolled and Azure AD joined as well. So user is going to complete their portion of the process by providing their username. And then here we'll process any additional policies and apps that are targeted to the device or user post the pre-provisioning process, and the user can now sign in to their devices and be productive right away because the device is already pre-provisioned, but it will also start to receive any additional apps and policies that may have been targeted to Allison after the device has been pre-provisioned. Again, here, some applications only get installed at sign-in times, Teams being one of them, and the other ones that we talked about are progressive web apps, which is what Wikipedia is. So over the course of a few minutes, Allison should have all of the applications that were targeted to this device, and you'll see that this mimics the start menu layout experience that we saw initially. All right. So to finish the process here, we will cover the final remaining ways to enroll Windows 11 devices using bulk enrollment. So these are enrollment flows that do not require user interaction to get the device provisioned. Simply would get the device at a point where the user is successfully able to log into it. And depending on which experience you use, the device may already also have all of the policies and apps that the user may need. All right, so let's go with the first one. The first one is the provisioning package here. And for this one, we are going to leverage an application called Setup School PCs app, which is an app specifically designed for creating provisioning packages for school devices. More commonly used in K-12 for shared devices, but there are also configurations for devices that are intended to be one-to-one. So we'll proceed with that. The new version that I'm using here will be the version that's going to be released soon, that is compatible also with Windows 11. So for here, I'm just going to give it a package name. I'm going to add a work or school account here for me to be able to acquire the token that's going to be used to successfully enroll this device using a provisioning package. And I'm going to indicate which wireless network I'm going to use to be able to provision those devices. So this, as soon as I insert the USB, will add that Wi-Fi to be able to enroll those devices. And I'm going to select Windows 11 as the version of the device that I'm going to be using in this case. So as you can see here, there are a couple of choices for optimizing the device depending on the scenario that you're going to be using this device for. So we'll just accept the defaults for now, but you'll be able to configure whatever settings you want. And here you can choose to select a prefix, or you can just proceed with the default name that the device will ultimately already have if you have a base image, for example. I'm not going to configure any time zone, or to simplify the experience, I'm not going to have also a take a test profile, but I'm going to pre-cache Minecraft as well as the company portal so that as soon as the device gets provisioned, you already have those apps there. And I'm going to keep the customizations the same. So now what I'm going to do is accept the configurations that I had. I'm going to save that to a USB so that I can take that USB and plug it into a Windows 11 device, very much like I did for Windows 10. And the Windows 11 device should automatically detect a provisioning package in the USB and begin right away provisioning that device. Okay, so now let's take a look at the experience of provisioning a device with that provisioning package that we just created. And just to make sure that it's clear, this is a provisioning package specifically using the setup school PC app, but you could have done the same process using the Windows Configuration Designer tool to generate your provisioning package, and overall the experience will be similar for provisioning the device, but the set of pre-configured options will be different, right? So the idea here is for the setup school PC app, because it is targeted for education, we've embedded a lot of the commonly configured settings as part of the workflow, which you will not necessarily have available through the standard experience of Windows Configuration Designer. All right, so now it's the provisioning package and Windows 11 enrollment flow. Again, it's a corporate type enrollment. The device gets Azure AD joined and subsequently MDM enrolled. And one of the cool benefits, this is a very quick and easy and predictable process. It's also very flexible. As part of the provisioning package, you can actually add additional settings or applications that you may want to have configured as this provisioning package is getting applied. This way, by the time this initial provisioning process is done, the device at least has its basic set of settings, and you don't necessarily have to wait for those policies to be deployed via policies and apps to be deployed via Intune. If you are time constrained and you want to make sure the devices get out as quickly as possible to end users, so once they get it, they'll receive any sets of additional policies and applications once they begin using their devices. Okay, so again, standard OB flow, the device is in the out-of-box experience. You plug in the USB here, and as soon as you see the screen, you plug it in, plug the USB in, it's automatically detected. You don't have to do anything to be able to force the provisioning package to install. And because you added a Wi-Fi that's going to be used for this process, it automatically applies it and will automatically get the device Azure AD joined and MDM enrolled, or in any applications that you've injected as part of that package will also be added here. So when Allison logs into the device, she'll be able to see anything that you pre-configured as part of the package, and policies are going to start to flow down from Intune. And depending on the number of apps and policies you have, it may take a little bit of time for all of the apps and policies to converge, but they will trickle in as Allison logs in to her device. Okay, so for our final one, now we're going to talk about autopilot self-deploying mode, and this is, one of the easiest ways to get devices quickly configured without requiring, any type of USB or touching the device in any way other than just simply plugging in an Ethernet cable, which is not required, but it would significantly automate the process of provisioning the device if Ethernet is used. But it can also be used with a wireless connection, but it would require manual action from the end user to be able to connect to Wi-Fi, which is the same flow that we saw with the user-driven flow. So for this one specifically, device, again, will be Azure AD joined, but there will be no user affinity, very much like the previous process with the provisioning package. There's absolutely no end user interaction during the actual enrollment process. And together with the enrollment status page configuration, which can be configured to force specific set of apps and policies to be present before the user gets to the desktop, it provides a very clean end user experience for first use of the device, because by the time the user gets to the desktop, you can ensure that some basic set of policies and apps are applied, guaranteeing that the user will have what they need on first use. So here, the process was completed. The user will log in and will have any pre-configured settings that was part of the enrollment status page configuration, and will then also start trickling any apps and policies that are targeted to Allison or her device, very much like the other flows that we talked about. All right, getting close to the end here. So just a quick recap of what we talked about here, the overall enrollment experience. First and foremost, because of the significant change with the start menu, we started by discussing ways that we can customize the start pins and taskbar so that at the first use experience of the end user already contains, a customized experience that the admin has defined. Then we talked about all the personally owned enrollment methods and experiences, starting with modern app sign-in. We discussed the add a worker school account, as well as the guided flow using the company portal, where Allison was also able to self-service available applications. And then finally, we talked about corporate-owned device scenarios, starting with corporate-owned scenarios with user interaction. That was the standard out-of-box experience without autopilot, followed by the autopilot user-driven mode, and then finally the pre-caching of apps and policies with the autopilot pre-provisioning flow. And we ended with the corporate-owned enrollment scenarios without user interaction. And the first one we completed was the provisioning package, where we pre-cache some applications and configured a few settings. And we finished it with an autopilot self-deploying mode combined with the configuration of the enrollment status page to ensure that the user had the set of apps and policies pre-configured before they were able to use their computer effectively. Just a few resources here to help you in your journey on the various areas that we didn't directly cover, but we covered as part of a lot of the resources that we have in our docs, in our interactive guides. We also have a Intune for Education YouTube channel that covers the individual aspects of device enrollment for Windows 10. And we've also published these Windows 11 experiences for your consumption as well, which you can review it afterwards by going to those links. And now I want to turn it over for any questions you may have.
Hey, Carlos, I'll read some of them off from the chat for you. Andrew Sanders writes, can the default behavior be changed to where allow my organization to manage my device is not checked?
Unfortunately, that is not configurable. And we are trying to figure out a more optimal way that we could configure that screen to make it more intuitive to end users. But unfortunately, that experience cannot be controlled. It's actually built into Windows, and there's no configurability aspects to it today.
Brian Arkills has a few questions. The Azure AD registration plus Intune enrollment workflow is broken. Microsoft has chosen default behavior, which does not align with what many universities would prefer, and not given us options which would allow us to change behavior. I guess that was just in response to that. He also writes, is there any planned change to the existing AAD device registration experience for a personal device where someone who is in the MDM scope but not a MEM scope? If Intune enrollment does not allow for personal devices, then the AAD registration is deleted after the fact currently. The user is not given the allow my organization to manage my device dialog at all, so there is no way for the user to get AAD device registration without adding them to the MEM scope.
I mean, I think this is good feedback. It's a feedback we'll capture. As I mentioned, we were discussing better options for that entire automatic MDM and Azure AD registration workflow. So it's good feedback for us to take into account as we are trying to figure out a better experience that meets all of the different scenarios out there. So thanks for that.
Just some comments going back and forth about handing devices to students. We had somewhat of ad hoc loaner, more loaner. I fear we have lots of devices that have been AD registered that not looking at yet. Does anyone have people frequently agreeing to institutional management of personally owned devices? I'm going to say yes. especially around the holiday time when people get Windows 10 devices and the students and whatnot start them up and it says, please sign in with your work or school account. We get people to do that.
Well, the pandemic in general, right, Steve? Because a lot of the students and its staff, teacher and staff, ended up using their own personal devices to access work or school resources, increase the amount of inadvertent registration of devices in Azure AD and Intune. This is exactly why we're discussing, better options for that dialog box to make it clear what the end result is of choosing OK. And we actually made some progress. I don't know if many of you caught, but we added a little bit of a warning underneath the checkbox, which wasn't even there before, as a first step to at least providing some more transparency of what was happening as a result of selecting OK. But we all know that most of the time, especially when it comes to students, that they won't necessarily read those smaller notes. They'll just ultimately hit the only option they have, which is OK.
Keith Sumo writes, and I think it's more of a comment, line of sight is required for hybrid join if started from the AED side. Of course, a VPN can be leveraged to address that need.
Yeah, that's right. You can use a VPN and uncheck the option to require line of sight, but at the end of the day, you're going to have connectivity one way or another to a domain controller to be able to complete the domain join portion of the process.
Sure. I don't know if you're the right person to answer this, but Scott Piner writes, I'm about to upgrade to MEM CM from 2103 to 21.7 and would like to install the Windows 11 ADK at that time. I have not seen any documentation, but can still deploy Windows 10 with. I have not seen any documentation, but can we still deploy Windows 10 with the Windows 11 ADK installed? I would assume so, but seeing it in print would make me feel better.
Yeah, that's that's a configuration manager question, so it's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. So perhaps we can follow up on that one, but I don't really have the answer.
And if anybody has any questions and wants to come off mute and ask while I'm going through these, please do so. Kevin would like to know how many years has it Microsoft responded with that. That's good feedback, only to ignore the feedback. We don't ignore the feedback. We take it and obviously process it.
Yeah, and I think one important thing to note here is I'm part of the Intune for Education team focused on exactly what you just described. What was the name of the person again? Made that feedback? Kevin,
Kevin.
yeah. So yeah, Kevin, we hear you, but progress has been made. My role specifically is to be part of the engineering and product group organization to be able to capture those insights from directly from customers and drive them hard, based on overall impact. So yeah, we totally hear you that sometimes changes don't happen as quickly as we want them to, but functions like mine were actually designed exactly for that purpose, is to really capture feedback directly from customers and make sure that we bring it back into our development cycle as we build new product features.
Minimize your Outlook pop-up there, buddy.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
No worries. Paul Morrison writes, our issue seems to be that Intune doesn't have sufficient division and delegation ability to account for the fact that we are a decentralized institution. I'm going to push back you on a little bit, Paul, because we do have the ability to create scopes and roles, and if they're not meeting your needs, please let us know. We did get some feedback the other day on it, but the ability to actually create different scopes and different roles within Intune is built into it.
That's right, and it can be combined with also the Azure AD roles. We heard some limitations yesterday, so love to hear feedback around specifically which limitations are preventing you from implementing it. But as Steve mentioned, Intune does provide RBAC capabilities, so it'll be interesting to see which ones are lacking for your organization.
And that's the end of the questions. There's just some comments being passed back and forth. All right, happy to hear that, is what I'm hearing from our institutional team.
Okay.
And if anybody's got any questions, please come off mute at this time. Caden did put the link to the survey in there. Please do fill out the survey. We would like your feedback. And if at this point nobody has any other questions or nobody's going to come off mute, I am going to stop recording.